Greetings, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a video for my Lindenwood University course in experimental writing. In this video, I thought it might be useful to talk about uh, experimental writing in sort of a moderate kind of way. We just got done reading some highly experimental stuff, and we're about to transition into a little bit different sort of way of looking at experimental writing. We're going to look at a whole story collection, which is experimental in its concept, not so much in its line by line narrative technique. And so I thought it might be good to talk about the fact that it's not all or nothing when it comes to experimentation in narrative. And what I mean by that is some of you seem to have really been taken with experimental writing and really looking at unorthodox, non-traditional ways of telling a story and are inspired to really push the limits on that, and that's terrific. Others of us, though, may not be as eager to really go that far out on a regular basis. And so I wanted to emphasize the fact that, like I said a minute or so ago, it's not all or nothing. In other words, I think you can write fairly traditional narratives and really add some interesting aspects to them by incorporating some experimental features in them. So again, it doesn't have to be strictly traditional or strictly non-traditional. It can be some sort of moderate area. And I initially had pulled all sorts of books off my bookshelf with different examples of different writers who were trying kind of varying degrees of experimentation. And then I realized I really didn't have to, pull all those books off the shelf. I could just use this book. And this is Joyce Carol Oates' story collection, Marriages and Infidelities, from 1972, I believe. And it is a big collection. There's a lot of stuff in here. As you probably know, Joyce Carol Oates has been a prolific author for decades and decades. So has lots and lots of books to her credit, and writes all kinds of things, short stories and novels, but also critical pieces and poetry and so forth. But I thought this would be an interesting volume to look at because it does a couple of things which we've sort of touched on throughout the session. And one of them is it has several stories that are sort of revisionist pieces that Joyce Carol Oates wrote in the, I think probably all in the 70s, maybe going back to as early as the late 60s, but I think primarily in the 70s. And as you know, revisionist fiction is when an author is inspired by another work of fiction, earlier, generally speaking, well-known work of fiction, and decides to use that for their own kind of creative platform, writing a prequel or a sequel or just some variation thereof. And as you also probably know, I'm particularly interested in revisionist fiction. I teach a couple of courses here for Lindenwood that are revisionist fiction oriented. I am a revisionist fiction writer myself, and really enjoy that approach to creative writing. And so I wanted to kind of share with you some examples of that. But also, these are stories that range from being pretty traditional in terms of narrative technique to being not so much so. None of them are wildly experimental, but again, I wanted to kind of share them to show you that you can use some experimentation without going, all the way to some of the wildly, experimental, non-traditional stuff we've been reading. All right, so this is a copy of. The book is a used library copy. I didn't steal it from a library. As you probably know, you can go on Amazon or, such places and get pulled library books for quite, inexpensive amounts. And so that's where this one came from. But again, not all of the stories in this collection are revisionist, but she had sort of a stretch there. I think primarily in the 70s where she was sort of playing with that. And she took some classic stories and used them as inspiration for her own short fiction. They were published in, mainly, really well-to-do, really well-respected literary journals like the Iowa Review and North American Review and so forth, and then ultimately ended up in this collection. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of them. And again, some of them are very traditional. Others of them play to some degree with experimentation. So I'll just kind of share a little bit about that. One of the pieces that is in this collection is inspired by Kafka's classic, The Metamorphosis. And in this version, it's mainly, I would say, traditional, but Joyce Carol Oates plays with, from time to time, um, she inserts italicized paragraphs into the non-italicized paragraphs. And basically what happens there is a shift in perspective in the story. The main character kind of locks himself away in his bedroom. And so most of the story is in his point of view. But his family, is doing stuff during this time period. And so Joyce Carol Oates makes us privy to that, what's going on with his family, through these italicized insertions. And again, there's no line break, there's no kind of visual, sense that we're changing POV other than just these italicized insertions. And at first, it's not quite clear what they are, what they're doing there. It takes a little bit of reading the story and reading everything kind of in context to understand what she's about. So again, mildly experimental. So just inserting these italicized bits in what otherwise is a pretty traditionally told narrative, chronological for the most part, from start to finish, other than some sort of flashbacky memories and so forth along the way. So that's one way that she has experimented just a bit. Then another story that she wrote, Where I Lived and What I Lived For, kind of plays off of Thoreau's classic chapter from Walden. And you can perhaps see that she begins with just a simple statement: I ran, no punctuation. And you'll also see on this first page that it's carved up into little chunks of texts. I guess they're paragraphs, but notice they're not indented. And there is a line break between each one. And the whole story follows that format. So she's playing with sort of traditional, characteristics of text on a page. Again, no paragraph indentions, even though these little chunks of text read sort of as paragraphs. In some cases, no punctuation at the end of them. In some cases, dashes instead of periods. And in that way, just gives a different look and different feel to the story. Could have been told essentially with paragraph indentions and more standard punctuation, but she opted not to do that. She opted to choose a somewhat different format to give the story a somewhat different feel. All right. Another revisionist piece. This is The Lady with the Pet Dog, which you may know is a classic Chekhov story, highly anthologized. The title can vary because it's a translated title, obviously, from the Russian. So sometimes it's the woman with the toy dog, the woman with the little dog, the lady with the whatever dog. So the title may change a little bit in terms of wording. But this is interesting because it's not particularly experimental. It uses pretty standard narrative technique. She does have it broken up into sections that use Roman numerals, which again, that's pretty standard stuff. But so even though she's experimenting with the fact, she's inspired by this classic Chekhov narrative. The telling of the tale is pretty straightforward, and so therefore, only mildly experimental, I would say, and that is mainly just in the concept itself. This is an interesting story, The Spiral, and notice that it begins with the word matter, and this story, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's inspired by the classic movie, The Spiral Staircase, which was kind of a thriller from the 1940s. And the movie was an adaptation of a novel titled Some Must Watch by Ethel Lena White from 1933. And again, I think that's the etymology, so to speak, of this story. But she carves it up into sections, and there's basically two characters whose point of view kind of we bounce back and forth between. And one of the ways that she signals those transitions is by titling some of them matter and some of them, as you see here, antimatter. And notice the matter is on the left-hand margin and antimatter, I guess appropriately, is on the right-hand margin. Here we have a spread with both matter and antimatter on them. And these concepts of matter and antimatter were things that Joyce Carol Oates has experimented with, played with in other stories and other novels. Here, like I said, she's largely using it as a sort of a switch in perspective device, but rather than simply say, part one, part two, or whatever, she's using the concept of matter and antimatter and bringing in those kind of metaphorically into the text as well. All right. So again, mainly a pretty straightforward narrative in terms of technique, but in terms of shifting perspective, bringing in this idea of matter and antimatter. Another classic that Joyce Carol Oates played with that ended up in this collection was Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, which is one of my favorite little novellas, long stories, whatever you want to call it. It's maybe a ghost story, maybe not. In any case, it's really weird and I really like it. I've taught it several times and in different courses for one reason or another. But here, Joyce Carol Oates plays with the classic The Turn of the Screw. And it's sort of in the form of diary entries. If you can see, they're dated. But beyond that, so it has kind of an epistolary feel to it. The diary entries themselves are very narrow columns. So notice that in the collection, they're printed 2 columns per page with some ample white space thrown in there. So again, that gives them a different sort of feel than if they took up the entire margin or whatever. So here, again, a fairly straightforward narrative technique. Her style is somewhat abbreviated, meaning that there are quite a few sentences which are phrases. They're not complete sentences, or maybe in some cases single words, make up an entire sentence, quote unquote, right? But otherwise, they're dated. So there's a chronology to the story, and then, like I said, she's played with the sort of narrow, almost newspaper-like looking columns, which gives a somewhat different feel and texture to the story, right? So experimenting with that aspect. And then the last example I'll show you here is playing with James Joyce's classic little novella or long story, the climactic piece in Dubliners titled The Dead. And this is actually very traditionally written. So similar to The Lady with the Pet Dog, it really doesn't play with experimental narrative technique. It's not even carved up into sections like the the Chekhovian-inspired story, but again, it's experimental in the concept in that it's playing with Joyce's classic story, The Dead. And like I said, I could pull lots and lots of other examples. In fact, I did pull them and then decided to go a different route for the video. So a lot of writers have used experimental techniques sort of mildly or moderately with more traditional prose to achieve some really, really interesting stories. So if you are inspired to go whole hog, so to speak, and try some really, really experimental stuff, that's great. I certainly encourage that. But if you're not quite that into it, or if you're not feeling that you want to go quite that far out on the narrative limb, so to speak, you certainly can play with, sort of moderate touches of experimentalism with what otherwise would be, more traditional narrative technique. All right. So I would encourage you to think about that sort of spectrum from a lot to a little, or maybe none at all, I guess would be the other extreme. And to think about, what you might want to play with. And I think when it comes to someone like Joyce Carol Oates, I think she lets the narrative itself sort of dictate to some degree how much experimentation she wants to employ. And sometimes she chooses to go very traditional, sometimes not as much so. Right? So I will leave it there. And I'm curious to know what you think about, using bits and pieces of experimental technique along with a more traditional narrative technique. And I look forward to seeing you down the digital trail.